Good morning. Thank you for joining us here today for this Uyghur Human Rights Project event. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, the Uyghur Human Rights Project is a research-based advocacy organization which has been working to defend Uyghurs' civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights according to international human rights standards since 2004. Today, we're going to be discussing our upcoming report on the targeting of Uyghur religious leaders in the ongoing crackdown in East Turkestan. There will be a Q&A segment towards the end of the event. The audience can submit questions in the questions box. Please state your name and affiliation if you're comfortable doing so. Our panelists today are Abduweli Ayup. Abduweli Ayup is a Uyghur linguist currently living in Bergen, Norway as a fellow with the International Cities of Refuge Network. He is a longtime advocate for Uyghur social and cultural rights through the promotion of Uyghur-language education and is currently working on gathering information on the widespread disappearances of Uyghurs in the ongoing crackdown. Peter Erwin is a senior program officer for advocacy and communications at the Uyghur Human Rights Project and is the lead author of UHRP's upcoming report on the targeting of Uyghur religious leaders. Rachel Harris is a professor of ethnomusicology at SOAS, University of London, whose research focuses on the religious and cultural expression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim groups. Her latest book, Soundscapes of Uyghur Islam, examines the religious practice of Uyghur women in a small rural village. Let's turn it over to Peter Erwin, who will introduce the findings of our report.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. Happy to be with everybody today. What I want to do is to present some of the details, some of the preliminary findings of the research so far. This will become a full-fledged UHRP report in the coming weeks, but I think so far we've been able to develop a rough outline of the report and some of the research that we've been doing. What we're looking at in particular is the mass detention of religious figures. But more than that, we're trying to map how imams have been targeted for decades and sort of get a sense of what this actually tells us about China's approach to the Uyghur population, but also Kazakhs and Kyrgyz as well. And what we argue in the report is that it actually tells us a lot. The state for many years, for many decades, has looked upon religion and in particular religious figures with suspicion. I think there's been efforts to control Uyghurs, for example, and religious figures in particular for quite a long time. So in terms of why are we actually looking into this? Why is it an important subject? I think in some ways it's not simply just looking at a new batch of detentions. There's considerable information showing that a lot of people have been detained, upwards of 2 to 3 million on the upper end. But I think why this group of people is in particular important to look at because of why they're detaining people and what it actually says about the Chinese government's policy. So the UHRP had a report on the Chinese government targeting intellectuals, so Uyghur intellectuals in particular, people who have some more influence among the community, the people who are in some ways are sort of the culture bearers of Uyghurs in the region at the moment. And what we found was that the Chinese government had been targeting these intellectuals in particular as part of the campaign, as sort of one of the main pillars of the campaign because of what these figures represent. Austin Ramsey of the New York Times had a great quote on this. I think it sums it up quite well, and I think it's worth actually noting. He said that as the guardians of Uyghur traditions, chroniclers of their history and creators of their art, the intellectuals were building the Central Asian Turkic-speaking society's reservoir of collective memory within the narrow limits of authoritarian rule. And I think that sentence is a lot. In some ways, it makes it very clear that what they're targeting, and also the ways in which Uyghur intellectuals have been able to find or to carve out some space to actually to express the Uyghur traditions within this authoritarian state, where the state had allowed some space for academics and intellectuals and even religious figures, in the preceding decades to exercise their freedom of expression and voices to a certain extent. They were able to carve out some space, and he says that their detention underscores the party's attempts to decimate Uyghur identity in order to remold the group into a people who are largely secular, integrated into mainstream Chinese culture and complying with the Communist Party, which again is exactly what's happening and very much parallels what's happening to Uyghur religious figures. So that's the reason we wanted to look into them. So it's very much the same, but religious figures, those with generational knowledge of Islam in particular that has been retained over many years. And just a few notes just to start out, and delimitation of the report. The report is not simply looking at religious restrictions or repression. We're looking specifically at religious figures and the impact of them. I think there's been a lot of work on religious repression and restrictions over the years from academics and other sources. And a few notes, I mean, for the audience, if there's some unfamiliarity around it, Uyghurs, of course, are a majority Muslim ethnic group in East Turkestan. It's officially called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Not all Uyghurs are Muslim, but most are. If you ask most Uyghurs, they will tell you that religion is central in some ways to the Uyghur identity. It's not going to be the same. There's, of course, some variation depending on who you speak to, how old they are, where they're coming from, if they're in the diaspora or they just recently left the country. So there's some generational difference as well in the diaspora, but central nonetheless in certain ways, but it might manifest in different ways. An imam in particular, typically in Islam, is a worship leader at a particular mosque, but they often have duties outside the community. And also the people we spoke to and some of the people we found who have been detained, they're also Uyghurs call them mullahs, which I think has different meanings around the world. But for a mullah for Uyghurs is typically an intellectual, someone who's studied, who is knowledgeable to a certain degree about Islam and has the ability in some ways to teach students as well. So we're taking a broader definition. So we have imams, mullahs, or also to a certain extent scholars, which would also overlap with the mullah, but also people who are involved with the mosque. So muezzins, for example, other people who have been detained, for example, for their association with the mosque. We're not speaking about people who have been detained for teaching religion to children inside the family, but people who actually take a more prominent role, either unofficially or officially. And this is something to note as well, is that the Chinese government has sanctioned imams to practice. So there's state-sanctioned imams who work in an official capacity. They're very much more restricted. But there's also imams who perhaps they're an official imam, but then they renounce this, or they just couldn't deal with the restriction and they do it more underground. So I think another aim of the report, again, first is to understand why it's happening, but to understand the restrictions, those religious restrictions, through the lens of these prominent religious figures over time. So there's a few, just in brief, there's a few methods of research. First, of course, just building on some of the academic literature and also some of the research from NGOs and other groups who have done this already, including UHRP. UHRP has looked into the religious restrictions over time, of course. In particular, over the past 3 or 4 years, though. But the second and third sort of sources of information, I think, are quite important because they fill some gaps, some knowledge gaps that we have. First, that we spoke to a number of imams or former imams, Uyghur imams in the diaspora. Many of them, if not all of them, were once active in East Turkestan for a number of years. So we're trying to sort of fill in the narrative, personal account of the trajectory of restrictions over time since really the 1970s, late 70s and 80s until today, or rather until 2016 or 2017 when they were able to leave or they were forced to leave. So we're trying to find out what the effects were on the ground. How did this actually alter the approach of the religious teaching? In what ways did people sort of push back against this in subtle, overt, or less overt ways? So we're looking from a narrative about the 80s until 2016. And I think this is interesting and important because it also shows you that what I was at least surprised by in some of the narrative reports or some of the conversations we were having with these people is that the 1980s in some ways were seen as sort of a religious revival, some space opened up for religious practice. And this is when mosques were being built and there's a little bit of space following the Cultural Revolution. If you watch the trajectory from 49, the founding of the country, until the Cultural Revolution, the restrictions were in place. Of course, you had the secular schools, or rather the Islamic schools that were converted to secular schools, for example. And then you had the Cultural Revolution where there was no space at all to express identity or religious belief at all. But it was interesting to speak to imams who, when we asked them, so where did these religious traditions come from? And typically it would be their parents who held these beliefs and had them, in their mind during the Cultural Revolution. Of course, they couldn't express them, and the 80s allowed for space to open up. And this is the time when a lot of these imams, for example, were becoming more active when they were sort of teenagers in the 80s, for example. What that also told us is that there's sort of, it's a longer history of Islam. I mean, Uyghurs have been practicing for quite a long time. In some ways, what's happening now parallels what happened in the Cultural Revolution. I mean, literally the burning of Qurans, the tearing down of mosques, things like this. But it also, I think, speaks to the fact that the question that we would put to them, or the discussion that would take place, was, well, do you see this as being retained in some ways? And some of the responses were that what's happening now is sort of the final attack, I think was the phrase that came across, was the final attack to try to eliminate Islam and a central pillar of the Uyghur identity. Another theme was also religion as resistance. I think we heard in several interviews, the Imams repeated the feeling that the harder the government actually pushed the Uyghur people in terms of religious restrictions, the more tightly they actually held on to those beliefs, which I found quite interesting. It's one thing that came out from a number of the conversations we had. One Imam actually told us, even went so far as to say that people realize that the only thing that could save us is religion. So in some ways, it altered the ways in which people practice and the ways they express their identities. And then the third source of information, and the one that's also quite key, is that sort of backing up the more narrative elements. It has been, and Abduweli Ayup will speak in more detail about this, is the compilation of a data set of a considerable number of either imams, mullahs, religious figures, scholars, people connected to mosques as well, people who have been detained for teaching in an unofficial or official capacity, and sort of overstepping the bounds. So we're looking at quite a considerable number of these people that we've been able to get together, again, not for the purpose of simply having another list of people, but also being able to look at, for example, how old they are, when they were detained, the reasons for detention, for example, where they're being detained is all very interesting to take a look at. A couple of things that I can pull out. Firstly, many of them simply disappeared, and there's been no information about them since 2016 or 2017. And 2017 is the date in which most of them were arrested, and that's consistent with a lot of the other reporting. One other key point is that prison sentences for this group of people, is the length of prison terms is very, very high. 17 to 20 years seems to be actually fairly consistent with a lot of them. In terms of the information that we have about 33 to 35% of the people who have reported that they are now serving prison sentences. Another key aspect is that those who are sentenced were typically in their 40s and 50s. And if you're sentenced to 20 years and when you're 50 or above, I mean, in some ways it's a life sentence. So that's sort of what we're looking at in terms of preliminary findings at the moment, and when this report will be out in the coming weeks. So that's something to look to. I think perhaps there's some more room to discuss it in more detail if there are questions, but I wanted to leave it to Abduweli to discuss some of his research and how he's been able to pull in some of this information and where he's getting it and what he thinks about the situation now. So I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll now turn it over to Abduweli Ayup to discuss some more of the methodology behind the report and some more details on the targeting of these religious figures.
Thank you, everyone. We start this research in 2018, about May. At the time, we planned to interview more than 300 Uyghurs. And after the interview finished in November, I found that most targeted population is religious figures. And at the time, about 300 imams enlisted. And then I keep updating the figures. And then recently, more than 600 imams were arrested.
Can you share your webcam, please?
Oh.
Thank you.
Oh. Should I start again?
No, that's all right. We can hear you.
Okay. And then recently, for June, the last update is 613 imams enlisted. And another after we enlisted those imams, and I consider what happened after those religious figures, those imams arrested to Uyghur society. And I interviewed the Uyghur camp survivors. I interviewed not more than 16 camp survivors until now. And they told me that after those imams arrested, and the Uyghur society people afraid of death, afraid of dying, because there is no imam to precede that funeral. There is not enough imam. People have to wait. And one camp survivor, she's from Netherlands, she told me that in Urumqi, people have to register and have to wait when somebody died at home or somebody died. So it's very sad to Uyghur society. And I interviewed another Swedish scholar. He visited East Turkestan in 2018, and he told me that people now, Uyghur people, not afraid of living, they are afraid of dying because of the mosque demolished and because of the imam arrested, and there is no possible to hold the funeral, to hold the ceremony, the funeral. So it's very tragic even. And after I enlisted those imams, I also noticed the ages. And there are some very old aged imams, for example, that Abduweli Ayup from Artuch. He arrested in 2018, and now he is in Tumshuk County, and he's over 90 years old. And some other imams from Kashgar and Urumqi, they are also very old, about 63, I think. They are about 70 years old. So it's most concern right now for me, because there are Mehmet Salih Damullam. He died in concentration camp in 2018 February, and another Uyghur religious figure, Abduweli Damullam, also died. He is from Hoten in concentration camp. And another Uyghur imam, Memtimin Yunus, he died in 2020. It's about June. So now I wrote to different organizations, and I think we should concern those people who are old-aged Uyghur imams, because their life is in danger. And after that, I interviewed the people in Istanbul, and the people afraid of that after those imams arrested, and who will proceed Uyghur, for example, that Uyghur from birth to death, there is 3 different ceremonies. For example, the birth ceremony should preside by imam, by religious figures. And the wedding, they should be the religious, imam should preside that wedding, nikah. We have this tradition. And after you die, there's imam to preside that funeral. So the problem is, after those imam arrested, what will happen? Those people who are living there, and how do they practice their culture? Because Islam is a pillar of Uyghur culture, and without those imams, without the mosques demolished, and it's impossible to keep this culture alive. And I think it's also the concern. And I hope for me, the most important thing I wanna I wanna speak, and I wanna mention that the imams who are old aged and who are senior citizen, and they should be concerned, and this topic should be mentioned in our research or in the media. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn it over to Rachel Harris to give us some background on her research and how it ties into the issue of the repression of religious expression in East Turkestan.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel, and thank you for doing this report. I really welcome this research and the job that you're doing here to highlight the detention of imams. I think, you know, those of us who are active in the secular sphere in the West have been quite focused on intellectuals, and that's partly, of course, because, you know, we have direct contacts with many of these Uyghur intellectuals who have been detained. They are our colleagues, and so, as Peter has said, it's right, it's completely right that we pay attention to them. They do have a very important role in the transmission and the knowledge which encompasses Uyghur culture. But for me, I think the imam, the religious leaders in Uyghur society, are really much more important, because their role in transmitting knowledge, in acting in roles of leadership, are just so crucial, really, throughout the whole of Uyghur society. You know, they are really the pillars of society, deep down within the village and the local neighborhoods. And so that is why the mass disappearances of imams is such a terrible blow against Uyghur culture. That really is, I think, a very destructive way of attacking the social fabric of Uyghur life. You know, for myself, I spent quite a lot of time doing field work in rural Xinjiang or East Turkestan over the past 10 years. And when I was thinking about this panel, I had a very clear memory of the first time I met a rural imam. It was a mullah, actually, an educated man who was he was an official in the local town. But anyway, so he came to visit the family I was staying with, and he drove up on a motorbike. There was extraordinary flurry of activity from the family I was staying with. They went rushing off to find the best food to set before the mullah. And I remember sitting there and thinking, wow, you know, this guy is really something. What is it about this guy? And of course, it is exactly that role in teaching. They teach faith to children. They officiate all these rituals. I mean, really, I'm extremely struck by Abduweli's comment there that people in the Uyghur region now are afraid to die because the proper rituals cannot be conducted because the imam have been locked up. I mean, I think that is just very striking. Again, we've been focusing a lot on the destruction of built heritage in this region over the past year. We've been looking at the destruction of mosques and of pilgrimage sites, and all of that again is extremely tragic and shocking. But I think that the attacks on human beings, on these religious leaders is so much more important. So I warmly welcome this report. I would just like to say a word perhaps about women, about female religious leaders in Uyghur society. Imam are men, right? And there is not an equivalent kind of officially recognized religious category for women. However, female religious leaders are extremely important in Uyghur society. They do exist and they're very important. And really the majority of my research over the past 10 years has been working with these female religious leaders, often called buvées. And they, you know, they don't officiate in mosques, obviously. They have a role within the home. But they do all of the same kind of important roles that the imam, the male imam do, but the buvées are working with the women. So they officiate over the funerals of women, they teach children to recite the Quran and all that. And they also have an extremely important role in society, just like mediating disputes, giving advice, conducting all sorts of rituals. So I have a particular concern about these women, because especially for the women, the female religious leaders in rural areas, it's extremely difficult for us to get information about what's happened to them. But I am sure that they, alongside the men, have also been targeted. Even back 10 years ago, when I was studying in the village, working with these women, I know that they were under pressure from the local authorities. I know that some of them had already been arrested for teaching children to recite the Quran, for instance. And I would really urge Uyghur Human Rights Project, if they have a little bit of spare time and energy, and if it is possible to do another report, I don't know, or an addendum to this report, just to reflect a bit on what's happening to the women, please. Thank you.
Nicole, can I add something just about Rachel Harris told us? Yeah, actually, I thought about it. Like after I enlisted those imams, I found out that there is no like female religious leaders there, and why we all like enlisted the male imam, because of the confirmation this process, and we confirmed this through government websites. For example, that in Xinjiang Islamic Association and in every prefecture and even some counties we have like Islamic Association. It's government department, and after, like when we confirm, we need to find their names. For example, that imam arrested, and I should search the internet, and I found that this imam is on the list of the like government department. And then yes, this is imam, and this one, because of like after those imam arrested, the like information about them, all of them are deleted. Like when we confirm, I use this method. Like after you told me like the imam arrested, and I like search online and found that Islamic Association's website and find that there's no that one's name anymore. And then yes, that one is arrested. And so because of those.
Abduweli, could you share your webcam, please?
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, because of there is no such a website for female religious leaders, and like Chinese government officially recognize only Uyghur imams, male imam. They haven't recognized any female imam. So my problem is it's hard to confirm. For example, that somebody arrested female imam, but how can I confirm? But the information Uyghur community told me in Istanbul, most of the information are from like 2016, 2017. There's very few information about 2018 or 2019. So it is the problem of our side, and but we have some unconfirmed Uyghur female religious leaders we have, but we can discuss with the Peter, and we can add that. And another thing that it's a good suggestion to write another report about for women religious leaders, religious figures, because like in Uyghur culture, that especially the funeral should be, if that one who died are females, and that female religious leaders should conduct that. It should be women. So, for example, that we have more than 600 imams. I'm sure we have more than 600 female Uyghur religious figures too. Yeah. So I think we can think maybe as Rachel told us another report, or we can put this in this report. I think it's important. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just in relation to that.
Can I just give you a quick apology for piling extra work on your plate here?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple points in reaction to that. I think first, of course, it underscores the fact that it is simply very difficult to get any kind of information from the region, and that constricts or constrains any kind of reporting to begin with. On the point of looking at female religious figures, yes, I think it is very much in the literature. Even it's just underreported. It's just under research at the moment. So I think there's a lot of space to be looking into this, because certainly if you have a list that is overwhelmingly a majority of men, if you're looking at imams in particular, you're missing half the population. And you're also missing the ways in which the government's actually restricting religious practice from half the population. And there are, of course, different ways in which religious knowledge and teachings is transmitted through women, of course. And I think that is certainly there is some space there to take more specific looks at.
Yes, Peter, you say that it's been restricted for half the population. It's worth noting for people who might not know, but women and any boys under 18 are not permitted to enter mosques. And so given the current crackdown attempting to eliminate Islamic observation from anywhere in the public square and in the private home, it essentially means that women have been completely cut off from, even according to the letter of the law, practicing Islam.
I mean, I think it's very interesting to compare this situation with what happened historically under the Soviet Union. You know, I mean, there were also in, what is today Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so on, there were under the Soviet Union very concerted attacks on religion and a lot of destruction of mosques and all that. And yet the kind of religion which really survived was very much female-led. You know, this was religion that was conducted in the home. And because the Soviet authorities were not so focused on women at that time, you know, the women were actually able to continue a lot of the religious practices which might well have died out if they had not been targeted. But I think, you know, from what we know of what's happening in East Turkestan, in Xinjiang today, really the reach of the state has been so much deeper. You know, so we know that these government agents have gone right into the home, and they're you know, surveying people for any signs of religious activity, for keeping copies of the Quran, for praying even at home. And so it seems to me that in this situation, which is being currently experienced by the Uyghurs, there is no space for even informal transmission and practice of religion. And you know, if we're thinking about the possibility of resistance, which I know is something that you've been interested in your report, then I mean that really takes the sphere of resistance right inside the body. You know, I mean, what can you do except recite the Quran in your head silently, to say your prayers without moving, and that really is an extraordinary restriction on freedom of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, if I can respond to that too, is that in some ways what was coming out of these interviews we conducted was that what we've been seeing over the past 2 or 3 years in terms of surveillance and monitoring of people's homes and things like this, I mean, this existed with regards to religious people back in the 90s. I had a couple people say quite directly that they perceived a certain obsession with what's going on in the Uyghur homes. And this is in the mid-90s. There's an obsession in terms of what the parents were teaching the children even. There was quite an early identification of where the religious figures are in the community, and also where their relatives are and where their associates are, people they work with, for example. So very early on, there was this obsession with monitoring people very closely, physically, which we see sort of manifested today, but didn't really exist for the normal, regular, everyday population until the past few years. But you sort of see hints of this, I think, in the 90s, certainly. Sort of after incidents, especially in Gulja, for example, there's much more of this taking place. But yes, I think it's been extended. It had extended before we saw in the past few years the general population targeting religious figures.
Maybe Rachel could answer this question, but I welcome any other comments from our other speakers. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the Sinicization of Religion campaign and how the targeting of Uyghurs has been different from the targeting of other groups and their religious expression, since you study not only the Uyghurs, but other Muslim groups in China.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I think that is a very interesting question, you know, because China has large populations of Chinese-speaking Muslims, the Hui or Dungan, as sometimes they're called. And the question is often asked, you know, why are they not targeted in the same way as the Uyghurs and Kazakhs have been, you know? So if we are accusing the Chinese government of attacking Islam, then how come, you know, all these Chinese-speaking Muslims are okay? You know, so it is a very interesting question, you know. So the government excuse for these attacks on Uyghur culture is very much framed in terms of religious extremism, and yet, you know, we see exactly equivalent patterns over the past few decades within Chinese-speaking Muslim communities of interest in, you know, foreign kinds of religion, strands of Salafism coming into Hui communities, you know, exactly the same as what was going on with the Uyghurs. So why would the Uyghurs have been targeted this way? You know, so I think really it is a lot to do with language. When Xi Jinping, the president, called on Muslims in China to signify themselves, it has been a lot easier for the Chinese-speaking Muslims, the Hui, to kind of present themselves as being, you know, part of that narrative. You know, they can put this kind of gloss of signification on themselves much easier than the Uyghurs, who have found it hard to kind of play that game. And I think, you know, it's partly language, very simply, but also, I mean, I think it is just about racial difference and racism, purely and simply. You know, I mean, there are a long history of this kind of suspicion of the Turkic speaking peoples within China's borders, and I think that has really lain at the heart of some of these very brutal policies that we've seen.
Thank you. Abduweli, you spoke a bit about the prison sentences and kind of the proportion of people who have been given prison sentences. I'm wondering if you could give your opinion on, was this kind of the plan all along by the authorities to first detain people extrajudicially and then send them to prison? And to what extent are these at all public, the sentencing of people? This is part of a broad pattern of people being shifted from the camps into the prison system, a lot of which seems to be taking place with a great deal of secrecy.
I think it's the first is mass arrest, and then during there is a 5 process in the camp. First of all, you have to tell what you have done, and you have to confess that why I am here in the camp because of I have so-called mistakes. First of all, you confess, and then you have to during your camp life, you should write that I have this mistakes and I corrected my mistakes. The first is in Chinese, it's like 忏悔书. It means that you have to confess what you have done. You are already like indoctrinated by extremist ideology. You have to confess. You have to admit that I have done this. And second step is like learn about communist ideology, patriotism, and the Chinese culture, something like that. And after the 5th step, you can be released. But the problem is, depending on my interview, and I found that like most of the religious leaders, religious figures, they sent from the camp to the prison in short period of time. So now some of them released, but they are like, depending on my statistics, like imams, religious leaders from Urumqi, they released some. For example, that there is a imam, his name is Umar, and he arrested in 2017 in Urumqi, Veholiang, and he released in 2018. Yes, there is some of them released, but they are from Urumqi. And I only found the case who released from Urumqi. But in Khotan, Kashgar, and Artuch, no, I haven't had any case who released. And now, like recently, I received information that in Charchan, re-education camp, so-called re-education camp, changed it into the prison. And the door, before the door, the gate is red, and now the gate painted to black. And before it's like 技术教育中心, like a vocational training center. Now it changed it to Charchan prison. And so now there's a transition that like former re-education camp changed it to prison right now. So we cannot say that like who are in re-education camp, who are in prison right now, because that re-education camp already changed it to prison. So now it's hard to know which one is re-education camp and who are in re-education camp or who are in the prison. That's the problem. And I want to add something about that, the ritual. The mosque, depending on my research, the mosque is the last place we can use Uyghur. Like we cannot use Uyghur in education, we cannot use Uyghur in official bureau or branches and departments, and mosque is the last place we can use Uyghur, because those imam use Uyghur to preside pray. So I agree with her that like language, the very important part, and that language, if we can use the mosque often. We can say 5 times. If 5 times praise, and we can use 5 times Uyghur every day, especially in the historical and ancient like rural areas like Uyghur villages and Uyghur cities like Kashgar. So that's why the like Islam is targeted. Another, we can see that like mosque demolished and like sacred bazaar, we call cemetery, destroyed. But we can see something very interesting, that like Tungan, like mosque, Tungan mosque, like Chinese speaking Muslim mosque, that for Chinese speaking Muslim, they were not demolished, but some Uyghurized mosque, they changed into Chinese style mosque, like with the Chinese style building. So Chinese government targeted not the Islam itself. They target the Islam who are Uyghur characteristics. If it's Chinese characteristics, it's okay, the building and the language and everything. But if it's Uyghurized already, it will be targeted. I think this is, yeah.
I mean, I have very strong memories of like a period a couple of years ago when you could see pictures of the roadside in central China, you know, in Gansu, and they, you know, all these big beautiful domes that the Dungan, the Hui had built on their mosques, very expensive as well, you know, beautiful golden things, and they've been taken off, and they were all like sitting by the side of the road, you know. But I mean, I think their models were not only Uyghur, but also kind of more Middle Eastern, or you know. So I mean, it's a question of what they were thinking of as foreign, really. So I mean, were the Uyghur culture now counted as something foreign? You know, I think there's a lot that is significant.
Thank you for that. And Abduweli, that was a very good point about how there are not really firm lines between different types of detention. And it just underscores how difficult getting information about this issue is.
If I can just make a brief point on sort of that's of course the case. Firstly, is again underscoring the fact that it's very hard to get information from the region at all. It's hard to understand either whether they're in detention in camps or if they're in prisons. And the line between prison and camp has been blurred for the past couple of years. We're just not really sure. You know, are people being taken straight to camps? Are prisons the same thing as camps? One thing we did find is that, or that we found so far, is that people had been sentenced quite early as well. And this tracks with pretty massive increases. I think Chris Buckley from the New York Times had a report a couple of years ago about this, the massive increases between 2016 and 2018 of prison terms. And this was just the region in general. It didn't have any kind of specifics about who is being targeted. The assumption, of course, is Uyghurs. But from the data that we have too, it shows that in 2016 even, people are being sentenced to 20 years. I think that supports what Abduweli is saying, that, okay, perhaps they might go to a re-education facility for a month or two, but some of them are just simply being detained and sentenced to prison sentences quite early on, and they're not given any kind of chance. And then on the point about sort of the last place in which Uyghurs are able to express themselves religiously or to pray, it is in some ways the mosque. And that's where sort of the intersection between the physical destruction of buildings or mosques intersects with the ability of Uyghurs to express themselves. Because when you destroy mosques, which is what has been happening, you just physically eliminate the space, because that's the only space left, and you physically eliminate the space in which they're able to practice. And at the same time, as UHRP has written a report on religious restrictions in the past, a couple of years ago, detailing how the mosque essentially is the last place in which there's any kind of expression allowed, because the state is able to monitor people very, very closely. The imam, the state-sanctioned imam, is very closely watched by the government. They're literally handed the sermon to read out in front of their congregation. If some of the interviewees told us that if you deviated by one word from the officially approved version of the sermon, you can be detained. You lose your post as an imam, right? So in some ways, it's about eliminating the identity in the religion itself, but it's about controlling it. And you see that over the past few decades, every single policy is about how do we control religious expression. In the 90s, for example, they allow a little bit of space. Okay, they actually do allow imams to preach, and there is a bit of space for this. They say, okay, if we can't eliminate it, we're going to co-opt it. We're going to actually take steps to change it and make it more in line with the party. And you see that again. We can speak in more detail, but about these classes that begin in the 2000s, for example, classes that imams are forced to either leave the region and go to Urumqi or elsewhere to sit in front of teachers who say this is what religion should be, and it must be in line with the party. Essentially, so I think those are really important points that Abduweli also made as well.
I mean, I think. Sorry.
Before you break in, I just want to remind the audience that you can, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please submit them in the question box. We will have a portion at the end where we'll answer some audience questions. Sorry, Rachel, please go ahead.
Sorry, getting too enthusiastic there. But I mean, I think that Peter underlines an extremely important point there, that probably the vast majority of these imams who have been arrested, they were official imams. There were men who'd stood up in the mosques for years, giving the sermons that were given to them to recite by the government authorities. I mean, there is no way that we can understand these people as oppositional figures. They were doing as they were told. They were doing an extremely important job of mediating between the Chinese state and their Uyghur congregations, and quite often, to be honest, they were also attacked by Uyghur nationalists or more religious people who said, you know, why are you towing the party line like this? And what was their thanks for that in the end? You know, they were locked up. So I mean, I think it's very important to reflect on that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because after enlisted this imams, I found that even vice president of Chinese Islamic Association arrested. Vice president of Chinese Islamic Association, yeah. And why put you in that position if he is extremist or something like that? And vice president of Xinjiang Islamic Association also arrested, and the president of Aksu Islamic Association also arrested. And what happened to them? And you put them in position, and you allow them to preside the religious ceremony in Uyghur. And what happened to you? So, and another targeted that in East Turkestan we have Islamic schools. It's government branch actually, the Islamic school. We have a Xinjiang Islamic Institute, and every prefecture we have Islamic school. And this time, those students who graduated 20 years ago also arrested, because of their name, their archive, all of them are on the school, and they all arrested because of depending on their for example, that students in 1992, 1993, 1995. You can find that the students from the different grade, they all arrested depending on those grades, because their archive held by the government. And then when it started to target them, and they are available to target them very easily because of they have those documents on government's hand. And this time, who escaped easier because of those are not studied in that university, in that schools. Study religion by themselves, and study religion by themselves, they can have chance to go to Turkey, escape. But those students who study religion in government schools, they are arrested because of they have already registered their name on it, documented their name on it.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, what accounts for what might seemingly be this disjointed policy of attacking people, because the same thing happens with intellectuals as well, people who are getting grants from the government, and there's a long list of people who can be fit into this category, people who have sort of the blessing of the government. I think you see this persistent frustration, I think, on the part of the government over time, because they feel like they just can't eliminate this thing that they just don't see as helpful for what they're trying to do. So you see these sort of wild swings in policies at a local level too. There's different people trying out different things. But when you get the new party secretary, for example, and when Xi Jinping is in power, they take a much more hardline approach, which says, we don't care about what you were doing before. We don't care about your approach before. It wasn't working. So we're going to take a hardline approach that tries to eliminate religious expression completely. So it's hard to sort of track the trajectory of the approaches because they do seem to be disjointed, and they are. It's sort of their last effort in some ways to eliminate religion.
Peter, maybe on that point, you could explain the concept of two-faced people and how it's kind of more broadly applied when it comes to Uyghurs, and specifically when it comes to Uyghur religious figures.
Sure, and that was a theme that came up quite often, is that people being sentenced for being either two-faced officials, and typically officials who are sentenced for this or just relieved of their post, or people who would hear what the government is saying from Beijing or from Urumqi at the regional level, and they would sort of pay lip service to it. There's often is Uyghur people themselves who they aren't carrying out the policy on the ground to the extent that the government wants them to, because I think by and large you see local officials who understand probably better than people who are living quite far away that Islamic practice among Uyghurs is not a threat to the government. I mean, it doesn't have to be, certainly, depending on how you look at it. So you have local officials who are not pushing back necessarily proactively, but they hear the requests from the government in Urumqi or Beijing and say, yeah, okay, sure, we'll put that into practice. But on the ground, they probably recognize that to actually maintain stability, you need to allow people to be able to express themselves. And when you restrict them and you push them, it makes things worse on the ground. So I think people have been, they're sentenced to this, because of their so-called two-faced, I'm not sure exactly what the sentence would be in Chinese, but two-faced crimes, because they're not essentially, they're not implementing the policy from the regional government or the government in Beijing to the extent that the government wants. And at a certain point, this went on too long, I think, for officials, especially after 2016. They said, we're going to actually prosecute people who are not implementing the policy. And we're going to actually make an example of these people to ensure that other local officials are implementing the policy to the extent they should be. And you also saw this, I mean, this came out in some ways. There was the New York Times leaked documents where you actually saw local officials who were not necessarily pushing back because they cared about the Uyghur people. They were trying to get people released from the camps because for one thing, they needed the workforce, because they couldn't possibly have people in the region all going to these facilities because they had quotas and things that they needed to meet. So you see pushback, again, maybe not from a moral ground, but from a practical perspective on the ground, that they felt that the government, people above them, just did not understand the dynamics of what's happening on the ground. I'm not sure if anybody else can speak into more details about sort of the two-faced charge.
Two-faced charge, like those Uyghur who are government officials, mostly targeted with the two-faced charge. And for example, that vice president of Xinjiang, no, the Kiria County political, it's 政协 in Chinese, it's political consultant assembly, something like that. And the vice president of Kiria, the arrested because of two-faced charge, and that's because of the political consultant assembly in China. It's consisted with the people that with different area, for example, that artists and writers and imams, something like that, and they should play that role to the government in like political consultant assembly. It means that like there are representative of women and the representative of like religious people and like intellectuals and artists or something like that. And the government put them in that position to be double-faced. It's impossible to one-faced because you face to the people and also you should face to the government. So like this time, the people who arrested among the Uyghur intellectuals and the religious figures, or like in political consultant assembly, that organization is most targeted this time. Tunisia is targeted this time because of that is the constitution, that is the like institution to play just like a middleman's role in China. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think, sorry, it's such a great point in that like people, it speaks to the fact that people just seem trapped. They feel like they can't do anything, they can't step in any direction without being charged of doing something against the government. So I think that's a really great point that Abduweli brings up, is that, okay, you're trying to face the people in the government at the same time, and then the government says you can't do that, and then people just seem afraid to do anything, essentially. Sorry, I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, I was just picking up on the same point, exactly. You know, I mean, there is no more space for people who face in both directions. I mean, more specifically for people who do that mediating role between government and Uyghur people. So with that whole class of people gone, and that includes officials, imam, intellectuals, even artists, you know, there is no voice left. There is only direct control.
Thank you. I think now we have a little time to address some audience questions. There's still time for the audience to submit their questions in the questions box. So I encourage you to do so. First question, I think I can answer. Faith Aki asks, where can we access the report? The report is actually in the final stages of preparation, so it should be released in the coming weeks. I encourage everyone to sign up to our mailing list so you can find out about all our most recent publications, and you can also find everything on our social media and our website. She also asks, and I will direct this towards all our panelists, or although perhaps UHRP could answer this best, are you expecting reactions from the Chinese government about your report being published, and how are you planning on defending this report when your findings are denied or refuted by China? Well, China has been increasing the amount of propaganda on the Uyghur crisis, as you know, international media attention has become focused on it, and a lot of really great reports have come out, you know, not just from UHRP, but from many other think tanks and academics. They have attempted to refute some of our reports. We stand by what we said. And so I do anticipate perhaps a reaction from this, even if they don't name us by name. They have basically just issued blanket statements of that Uyghurs have religious freedom. I think the fact that all these imams have disappeared speaks for itself. I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on kind of how strong the evidence is about what is going on in terms of this specific issue.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from our perspective from UHRP. I mean, the report will speak for itself. I think the ways in which UHRP gathers data, it's based on evidence, it's based on facts, which is typically not how the Chinese government operates. So I would not anticipate having to necessarily defend every element of it, because whatever we put into writing that comes out is already defensible based on the facts that we provide, based on the evidence that we provide, the people we speak to, the sources. We rely on that. The Chinese government has in the past, of course, I mean, directly, and they do this with more and more frequency more recently, directly sort of countered some of the claims of previous reports. So we had a report on passports, as far as I know, I think a few months ago, and the Chinese government, I think the foreign ministry, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, actually had a press conference about it and refuted some of the claims in the report. I think in some ways, when the Chinese government is responding to things like this, it's sometimes a good gauge in terms of whether you're doing things correctly. I think if you're doing things right, the Chinese government feels threatened and they feel like they need to respond. So one other example outside of this research is that the Uyghur Human Rights Project is part of the coalition to end Uyghur forced labor, and there's a large coalition. There's been lots of attention to this, and because of the forced labor issue in the region connected with the camps, the Chinese government wrote a white paper that came out, I think, 1 or 2 months ago on their adherence. And the title is kind of laughable, but it tells you all you need to know about their adherence to international labor standards, right? And you see this with increasing consistency, is that over the past 5 or 10 years, and after this white paper came out, we looked at all the other white papers. We thought, let's take a look at what white papers have been released past 10 years and 20 years. In the 90s and 2000s, what are they focusing on? They're focusing on Tibet, because Tibet is in the news, people are speaking about it, and they feel a little bit threatened. They feel the need to respond to this. And then you see later in the 2010s, in the past 5 or 10 years, basically all of them are on either Uyghurs in particular or sort of issues that involve Uyghurs. So you see them feel threatened. And again, this happens from quite consistently from them. So I think it's almost like a mark of success if the Chinese government feels the need to defend it, because their claims are not based on evidence, but ours are.
Thank you very much.
I think we are expecting that kind of defense, because through defending, they will tell us more, because we don't know what's happening to them. And what they defend, I think they should provide something we don't have. We want to have that information. We want to have that evidence. For example, that after we disclose Karkash list, and the Chinese government like showed some Uyghurs, their name not on the list. And at that time, we suspect that this list not the whole. This is part of the list. After the lady show up on the CCTV, and we know that the people who are arrested, not only those 3,000, there are more than 3,000 people are being arrested. And this time, if Chinese government defend itself through the fact or something so-called evidence, and we can have that, yes, there are more. Like we cannot reach. So it's good. Like I'm expecting to that kind of defense. Like it's good for us, because we need to know what's happening.
Thank you very much. I would like to share with you a question from Corinna Barbara. Perhaps this would be best directed at Rachel Harris. She asks, when were women restricted from going to mosques? Perhaps you could speak to that policy and how it contrasts with other parts of or elsewhere in China.
It's not traditional for Uyghur women to attend mosques. I don't know how far that goes back, but you know, a long way. So that isn't a government restriction. That is customary. You know, I know in other parts of the Islamic world that women are able to enter a mosque in a sort of separate space, but for Uyghur women, the tradition has always been to worship at home.
Yes, but the law does kind of institute that, the Chinese government law, or is it not actually written down in law code? Because I know there are signs that say no one under 18 or women are permitted to enter the mosque.
I mean, policy has been very, very clearly focused on cutting the transmission of religious knowledge. So certainly, you know, there have been very strong prescriptions against teaching religious lessons, you know, your basic knowledge of prayer. That has been very tightly controlled. And so I think this, you know, no under 18s in the mosque is part of that attempt to halt the transmission of religious knowledge.
Uyghur ladies, and they practice their religion at home, and there are different religious ceremony popular among the females, and one is like hikmet. It's singing or something like religious songs, and another is Zara Khatna, also among the Uyghur women, and it's related to singing and like playing musical instrument. And also some religious dance, sama, and zikr. And this kind of gathering restricted. The first restriction is in 1997, after Meshrep restricted in Hulja. At the same time, Hikmet tradition also restricted. The first is in 1997 in Hulja, and then it restricted in different places. But it is officially restricted in 1997, but it still exists, keep existing secretly in Kashgar in Khotan. But after 2014, there is a campaign like Fan Hui Ji. It means that more than 200,000 government officials went to Uyghur villages, stayed there, and that's the point that Uyghur ladies' religious practice restricted, because those government officials stayed the village and visited the Uyghur home one by one. So that's the point that the Uyghur females' religious practice restricted. Before it's like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There were other sacred spaces that women and men both went to, namely the shrines. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the fate of the shrines in East Turkestan.
Yeah, you mentioned a good point. Yes, shrines female and the male can go together and they stay at the same place. Yeah, and the first shrines destroyed. It started in actually it's after this urbanization. The pretext of urbanization in Kashgar, first the shrine destroyed in it's 2000. I think it's after 2002. It's Arslan Khan. There is a Arslan Khan is he was a king of Karhan Empire, and that shrine is very famous in Kashgar city, and it's in the Kashgar city, and it destroyed in it's in 2002, and after that it's another destruction that in 2006. In 2006, Urumqi in one big shrine destroyed, and after that especially in 2014 and 2015, 2016, the main shrines in Khotan, for example, that Imam Asem, and in Kashgar, Ordam, and in Yarkent, in Dukhan Pasha, those 4 important shrines destroyed, and it means that the religious practice, both female and male practice in those shrines are restricted. Yeah.
I mean, if I may, the destruction of the holy shrines was something that caused me a lot of sadness, I must say, when I heard the news about this. I mean, these places are meant to be the burial place of famous kings or transmitters of Islam, and they used to be the sites for extraordinary kind of festivals, which are all sorts of musical and religious and storytelling events would go on, and they just show how you cannot separate between religion and culture in this society, well, in any society, right? But I mean, it's so very clear in Uyghur society that religious practice was the site for really extraordinary, unique culture, like the women's hikmet songs that Abduweli mentioned there, and also many Sufi traditions, so there's no separation here between the religious and the cultural. and they've all been under attack, of course. Yeah.
Yes, so we did get a question from Luke Miller about the targeting of artists, musicians, purveyors of culture. Or have they been similarly targeted the way imams have been? And UHRP has issued some reports on this topic. I don't know if Peter, you would like to speak to that, or if anyone else would like to speak to the targeting of cultural practitioners.
I mean, I can speak to that again, sorry. You know, I mean, one of my most important aspects of my research is working with Uyghur music. So I know of many musicians, good friends often, who have been incarcerated. I think over the past 3 years, we've seen quite a number of Uyghur musicians released, but they still seem to be in a situation of house arrest. They're not really performing in public anymore, and it seems that there is now a much tighter control on Uyghur music. You know, so there is a grand tradition in China of presenting ethnic minority peoples as peoples who sing and dance, and especially as people who sing and dance and look very happy about being part of the great Chinese nation. You know, so that clearly there is a lot of space still for that kind of more propagandistic display of Uyghur song, as long as it's it's got the right lyrics and people look happy, then it's fine.
Abdulaziz Ablat asks, when ordinary people or imams are disappeared, you can submit lists of people who have disappeared to UN working groups, such as the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention or Forced Disappearance. He asks if there is a UN or any other association to which the list of demolished mosques or sites such as sacred sites can be submitted. Perhaps Peter can speak to that.
Well, I mean, yeah, he's right in terms of you can make submissions to the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. Whether you can submit sort of cases of the destruction of individual mosques or other cultural sites, I'm not so sure. I mean, of course, UNESCO is the UN body that oversees this, but then, of course, it's in some ways maybe a jurisdictional issue, and if they're not actually if certain mosques are not part of a UNESCO list, for example. I know maybe Rachel can speak about the Muqam, for example, which is far, maybe you can speak about if there's any kind of connection with UNESCO, because there are some obligations there. I think so far we've seen UNESCO basically not do nothing, and we've seen no UN agencies really take up the fact that all these mosques have been destroyed, tangible and intangible cultural heritage that's being wiped off the face of the earth in some ways, and there's been no response. But I'm not sure, maybe Rachel has a few more comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been speaking out about in particular. I was involved with some of the examination process of China's submission of Uyghur culture to UNESCO, and even back in 2009, which was also not a good year for the Uyghurs, right? I recommended against UNESCO accepting that because I thought the situation was already very problematic. So, I have publicly, called on UNESCO to do more independent reporting and to consider withdrawing its designation of these Uyghur items of cultural heritage from its lists, given that China is demonstrably not protecting them in an appropriate way. And of course, UNESCO is extremely reluctant to do this because China is the largest player in the whole system of intangible and tangible cultural heritage in the world, so they are very much dependent on that relationship. It seems very clear to me. I've spoken to individual officials within the cultural heritage system in UNESCO as well, and they've said, are you sure, Rachel, that it would really be a good idea to kind of punish Uyghur heritage in this way by taking it off the lists. And that is an interesting suggestion, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond to that. But, you know, I mean, clearly UNESCO really needs to have some response to a situation of cultural genocide, such as I believe is going on in East Turkestan at the moment.
Yeah, if I can make a brief point on that, I think in some ways you need to be careful not to give credence to this idea that China's trying to get out to the world, which is what I think Rachel mentioned, is that there's this, the Chinese government quite often will rely on statistics like, look at all the tourists going to these regions. Tourist numbers are up, so that must mean that things are totally fine in the region. And they you know, you have these propaganda photos in Global Times and China Daily and stuff of just Uyghur women in Kashgar, for example, dancing or people singing. And this is a way to say, look, everything's totally fine. They're able to practice their culture and things. It's just this essentialization of it. But I think we need to be careful that the UN and UNESCO in particular are not saying that, yeah, okay, we're going to supposedly protect this intangible or tangible part of heritage, at the same time allowing the Chinese government to do what they're doing, to take a couple, like maybe the mosque in Kashgar or other actual physical structures, and say, yeah, we're going to protect that, because that's exactly what the Chinese government is doing. They're trying to supposedly protect certain monuments and preserve the culture, but not in any way that allows Uyghurs to practice or even go to these mosques that they're preserving or claiming are part of this intangible or tangible cultural heritage, right? So I think we need to be careful. There's a lot more you could say about the UN's position on this, but I'll leave it for another day.
Thank you very much. I think a good question to conclude with, which is, you know, a very large question, and I'll direct it at all the panelists. Judith Watson asks, what are the ways to combat the aggression toward the Uyghurs by the Chinese government? So basically, are there any comments you have about any sort of policy responses, perhaps by multilateral organizations, states, maybe by what can the general public do? So direct that towards all of you.
Well, I'll kick off just by saying that I have been very heartened by the concerted moves that have been made in the on the problem of forced labour. You know, I think that is a big issue, and it's really good and important to be putting pressure on these companies, these transnational companies who may be supporting forced labour amongst the Uyghurs by their involvement in these kind of distant trade chains. So I think the kind of research that's gone on there, and then the pressure that's been brought to bear on these companies is really important. And actually, you know, that does seem to be having some kind of achievable goals there, which is great.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think our staff has already put in the chat. UHRP has a what you can do page for it. So we can speak to individuals. So what can individuals do? I mean, there's a few things that are on that page, like, I mean, contacting your representative and telling them that this is an issue, to, I mean, of course, donating to Uyghur organizations that need the support. I think they need some desperate support in these times. There's lots of different Uyghur groups doing this, from people like, you know, groups like UHRP, but also people who are trying to teach Uyghur language lessons, things like this. So it sort of runs the gamut. Signing petitions or just staying informed about the situation is very important too. I saw some polls that showed that over half of the American population knows that the camps exist. I mean, maybe that seems like a pessimistic outlook, but I mean, half the population, that's a big number from a couple of years ago when you would say Uyghur to people and they say, who, I don't even know who you're talking about, and you have to explain it from square one. So there's some progress there. In terms of what governments can do, yes, I think on the forced labor issue, that is in some ways speaking the Chinese government's language, which is, you know, economics and it's money. And if they feel that they're being threatened, if they feel that companies will pull out of the region because of an issue like forced labor connected to the internment camps, and something can actually be done there. I mean, the point that I make pretty consistently is that we need to raise the cost of China for treating Uyghurs this way, and the cost at this point is not high enough for them to stop behaving a certain way. There's also in some ways an assumption that we can't actually change the government's behavior. I think we absolutely can in a positive way, but people actually in some ways need to to speak out. And it seems a bit cliche to say people need to talk about it or speak out, but when people like, you know, leaders in Europe, for example, who haven't actually been clear about what their position is on the issue, you have statements sometimes from foreign ministries and things that are a little bit weak, but having global leaders actually say, we're watching what's happening, we're concerned about it, and we're not going to tolerate it. I think that is actually a very important thing, because you see some of the changes that happened over the past few years is when the UN, for example, releases a report or concluding observations from different reviews that say that we're concerned about the situation, people take note. So I think there's lots of things that can be done, but the first thing is to actually be clear that we're not going to tolerate it, and to raise this cost is sort of insane in some ways, because the Chinese government is trying to be a global power. They're trying to lead the world in a lot of ways. We need to say, well, if you want to lead, you're not going to be able to if you treat people the way you are.
I'm not sure if anyone has anything they'd like to conclude with. We're just about out of time. I want to tell the audience that the full report will be released soon. So please subscribe to our mailing list and visit our website to stay up to date on our research. And a video of this event will be made available on our YouTube channel. I want to thank everyone who took the time to join us, to submit questions. We welcome any feedback. You can contact us at info@uhrp.org with any further questions or comments you might have. And thank you again for joining, and please join us for our next event. Again, you can find all information about our events on our website. Have a nice day.
Thank you.